In the Darkness I See by Anon Y. Chapter 1. A Lifetime of Questions. My father, although a trilingual translator, was always a man of few words. He had spent much of his transformational young adult years in the Stalinist hellscape of 20th century Russia. And so he felt that any unnecessary syllable was to be seen, I suppose, as an exploitative luxury. As a member of the exiled bourgeoisie, my father's meagre existence taunted him always. His 18-year rotational span of exile and imprisonment had left him without multiple digits on both of his extremities. To add to his tainted tendrils, the new order had given him a malnourished sense of purpose and an incredible exigency for domination. On one unforgettable night, there was a moment of great clarity that my father shared with me. He crafted a perfect synopsis of his partition of the Soviet Union's tragic tale. Intoxicated, fumbling through each roughly translated word, my father admitted, "You see, it is not of true men to subsist on the credos of greater men." A socialist at heart, my father was a revolutionary who had thought he stood with the proletariat at the infancy of the revolution, the cool October ripe with potential. Further solidifying his unfortunate persuasion, my father had believed the proletariat was sure to reciprocate his hope for egalitarian unification. He was a member of those especially misguided folk who had believed with all their might that the new Bolshevik system would accept a member of the bourgeoisie as a proletariat because of their inaugural favor. He soon came to realize that there was only one firm belief held amongst the envious vengeful. He would often chuckle through his remorseful tears and grant me a black pearl of resentful revelation. Once an oppressor, he would say, always an oppressor. The system that had followed the pseudo-Empyrean uprising of the Russian revolutionaries rejected him and his contemporaries like the two-headed serpents they were. As the envy of the exploited class fruited into hatred, an ultimate distinction of disgrace cursed all the members of the old establishment, my father included. That truth had somehow not been made clear enough to my father in the ramblings of that vile Russian manifesto. My father's reflective reminiscing always ended with the same question and answer. How could there be an observance of grace in the uprooting of a system? In response to the rousing, unaired question, he said more times than thrice, "A person upholding the old way is to be trampled as pieces of history always are." My father, the Ukrainian, was never much of a philosopher or thinker. Though his thoughts were simple, the most rigid, fortified, and steadfast copper-headedness always embedded them deeply within his mind, well before he ventured into any explication or discourse. His story of maturation was one of strife, intrigue, and searing affliction. Shortly after his imprisonment, interrogation, and final exile to Siberia in 1935, my father met my mother. My mother, the quiet Orthodox Christian teacher from Ukraine, withstood the laborious interrogations, beatings, and exile in the same stubborn fashion as my father. Their entanglement of scarred souls had flowered up from the hardest of circumstances, making their bond impenetrable. Together, my parents remained steadfast against tyranny, cold, and hunger for numerous years. Their time was especially noxious as, throughout the unjust turbulence, they remained unable to bask in the indulgent naivety of uneducated people. Both of my poor parents were left with the scars of 100 lifetimes. Even though they carried with them all the strife their enduring souls could take, they found the strength to entwine their lost threads of hope and execute a plan to escape from their fate. My parents, on the eve of October Revolution Day, with the guards of their camp in their drunken stupors, took their chance. My mother was 3 months pregnant with me and still managed to escape through the wire fence that had kept the hens clucking for all those years. They never truly expressed to me those crushing realities, haunting them in the stillness of the peaceful American evenings. I could never have understood their exultation over the freedom they had earned in the same manner anyway. Each time my disturbed paternal narrator reached that point in the story, where they were finally free of the country they had always called home, a sharp pain would pierce through my father's chest. His voice would dry up as if he were still in an interrogation room. The stories of the later relocation period of our lives were henceforth rushed and muddled. The retellings were further disorganized by my father's consistent and prominent drunkenness. The pair, and eventually our troubled trio, stumbled through Europe for many years before making it to the great American homeland. In 1957, we arrived in the land of opportunity, risk, and wealth. Boston was the new home for us dusty refugees. By that time, I was 4 and my father's life had seemingly come to an end. He was 58. My mother, much younger, was able to maintain some semblance of innocent optimism, which my father resented to his core. Their dichotomy eventually led to a disastrous marriage and 2 terribly dissatisfied mortal enemies, bound by obstinacy. My father, though continually tempted, never laid a hand on my mother. He could never bring that side of humanity back into his heart. Between his beatings in the camps and the migrant low life to which he was privy, his sense of masculinity had been so hastily robbed of him anyhow. The pivotal endocrinological system of that man had been destroyed. For a man of such little pride, hedonism and deliriousness were his only shallow passages to respite. To entice the senses enough to fall to rest, or be beckoned to rise, he gave himself to pleasure. That seepage of sewerage into the veins and brains of the only man I had ever loved created an overwhelming sense of resentment and angst within me for most of my young life. The same solemn glow, like some inglorious garb bespoke to them, was also worn by all the relatives and friends of my parents. The friendship shared by those peers was mostly a repeated and notable connection through united impotence. Never was a genuine smile or expression of joy shared amongst those Soviet soldier-like survivors. Only a shared sense of crushing defeat and ignominious anguish tethered them to one another. With sadness covering them almost equally, the most depraved anecdote always won the discourses. The victor above the tidal pool, usually my father, regained a fragment of their combined pride by most compellingly bolstering a collective melancholy. Atop the lives of my loved ones, the blanketed blue never effectively lifted. Discussions of approximate depth always revolved around the past relics of the great motherland. All but my father could seem to let go of their more direct resentment for the system that enslaved and exiled them. That stubborn orbit around his self-sustaining peak never left him. In fact, my father's nickname, gifted to him by my mother, was P. Cello, or just Cello, from the Russian Pozylit Chelaivik, meaning old man. The nickname was more than a simple joke. It was the perfect description of him, a crystalline embodiment of indignation. My father's spoken additions to the more current political discourses were especially exemplary of his namesake description. The anger that would seize the vocabulary of the poor old man served only as a repeated glimpse into the direct internal war that raged intractably within him. The same ideology that my father so detested as a young communist had become the most vital part of my parents' existence. He was in the New World, with industrialism and free market exploitation still fueling all endeavors. Capitalism, conflated with Tsarist tyranny by my father, remained as America's fixture. The movements and liberal directives synonymous with the information age only partially shrouded the truth of his saving nation, America. All the complex implementation of the contemporary designs to the idyllic world anew in slow motion. More important than the assimilation and acceptance of those stubborn truths was that my parents' Ukrainian bakery required a stoic sense of capitalism and an embodiment of the spirit of free enterprise. It all angered my father. My father never arrived at a peaceful nor perspicacious understanding of the human spirit. Not a learned man, he wasn't competent enough to discover the learnings of the great philosophers. On no occasion did he bathe in the auspicious transcendence of psychological truths, the only such cleanse from which true revelation may have been derived. Where the very essence of human existence was to be found, my father simply refused to look. He was never able to endure his suffering in all its glory. My life's work was always directed towards the mastery and proliferation of knowledge. Where one may have found the answers to life's most important ponderances, I searched. My path to psychology was heavy with sacrifice. I was unremittingly happy with that, as the workings of the mind were never to be taken lightly. The depth of the human spirit had, after all, enamored me since my first conscious trauma. The more cavernous my exploration, the more immeasurable my growth. All paths led back to one. The most frustrating realization I continuously encountered was that my life's work was often as equally consoling to my agony as the old man's solution, measured in fluid ounces. The overflowing answer to my father's pain remained effective until its and his eventual cessation. At the beginning of his bitter end, I felt very little. The false contrivance of my mournful tears was not deprived of sincerity by hate. The apathetic void was not some lofty refusal of correspondence to his destitute body. It was an obscurely joyous realization that his soul, one that had been irreversibly hurt by life's torment, was finally free to not be. Although I had lost most of my respect for him as he and I aged, he gifted me with a most urgent lesson at his near end. To all the people that meant something to him, my father spoke his life into untruth. What he said never escaped my mind. From atop his soapbox, on his last birthday, a few months before his death, he drunkenly spoke to all that seemed close to him. One particular notion, thrown out at the closure of his speech, called out to me. "A decent man's life," preached my father, "is punctuated by a series of difficult decisions and woven together by a collection of good choices." That truth, that simple sentence, though soured by the remainder of his spirited speech, I could never forget. I writhed with hatred at that unconscious denouncement of his life. The knowledge that his whole being was antithetical to that wisdom surely made his twisted heart's heart smile. What further angered me was the unshakable truth that I inescapably remained to be his anti-prodigal son, his gifted evil residing somewhere in me. Like hot coal, cauterizing an unmendable wound, he probed my goodwill with each word, evoking only pain. His subtle malice, felt all my life, underpinned that speech, that diabolical display of self-contempt. We stank of disgrace. So indeed there was more than apathy between us. Though my father had successfully established a micro-immortalization and named it me, his blood down the line, he was eventually abolished from the physical plane. Into some energetic realm he journeyed. Life, like a river, had finished flowing through him. All that remained was the memory of him, and his lugubrious lessons. Like some muddied alluvium, thick with begrudged sediment and ready for transformation, his bellicose ideas violently stuck with me. Though the need for structure and direction was espoused by many of my intellectual leaders, and I had taught all their parallel sentiments to my father, he had never attained a sense of robust purpose in one or a plethora of goals. That evasion of his thoughtful struggle with life was always a substantial distraction from the impending, rather than a solution to it. It was with much study and problematic resolution that I discovered that the verisimilitude of his productive life was as shallow as the anti-religious bedrock from which it had ungallantly grown. In the hearts of so many like my father, far too stained to ever accept true wisdom, dopaminergic focus brought little joy. In the mists of the information age, though, the refusal of religiosity became irrevocable. Lost in a sea of small achievements and status, they were all deprived of the wholesome warmth that their ancestors had inherited. Once the strangulated truths of the corrupted transcendental had been uncovered as unholy, There was no return to glory. The drive for knowledge that had led men through incredible strife turned inwards and emptied itself. My father along for the ride. Only moral destitution remained. The monstrously unstable life of the men who enthralled themselves with the hedonic pleasures of the fine world was purposeless and thus unfulfilling. The bearings of such fellows were never linear, consistently unsteady. My father's short-sighted pursuit of gratification and meager long-term accomplishments proved to be as shallow as his kindness. His faulty substructure failed him. It failed us. Always having an interest in the endocrinological truths of humanity, but never caring enough to classify them as such, my father would ground many of his arguments in the hormonal profiling of men and women. That approach, intertwined with the moral centrism that his pained heart had refined, was always rather satisfying for the wounded audience he gathered. There was always a reason to pull up your bootstraps and get back to work, but never one for pursuing the enrapturement of true purpose, sovereign greatness. He was far too arrogantly scientific to identify himself from the lost crowd. The main problem with my father's insistence on biology was that it was an unaired and accidental deferment to nihilism. Without a system of molecules indicating emotions, one's life, according to my father, was absolutely random. He was so close to the truth of consciousness, the truth of its divine creation through specification, peeking in between some of his syllables. He remained unresolved in his purpose throughout his life, espousing the stagnantly supposed truths that he could never justify in his own heart, but continued jamming into others' minds. There were many nights where I watched him in the dark, those truths gnawing at him. The communist mentality had truly stolen his whole. Scientific assertions always devalued his life. I watched on as the gradual degradation of all he wanted to be true took a hold of him. The virtues he thought clung strongly to life faded in the presence of secular pragmatism, his unfurled self. It was a means to an end, a circular war of intellect that answered one proposition and wedged open another. As it was, too, with all his posthumous pals, my father found his faith in the final weeks of his life. Between violent seizures, my father would write. His new understanding, abridged, was that life was about facing suffering head-on. His moribund predictability truly stifled the last of my hopes. Using previously detested endocrinological truths, he discovered the subjectivity of our self-serving thoughts, and his nightly visions proved them to be senseless. Borrowing from Nietzsche, he began his structured and regimented derivation of meaning at the end of his life. By that time, the alcohol had taken a hold of much of his mind, disallowing coherent speech. However unspeakable my father's psychological consequences became, he managed to write. He wrote out many scrambled pages of revelations. Though mostly made up of derivative ramblings, a paragraph from the latter half of his final words interested me greatly. While he slept, a couple days before his last breath, I found him grasping at a single note. I discovered the document he prized most. Within it, there was one resounding proof of his existence. The message sang true. The following words echoed in my mind for months. Meaning and painful daily action will inevitably lead to a more rooted and significant existence. The search for meaning is deeply ingrained in struggle. From the Russian peasants of the 17th century in the uprising of Bolotnikov to the early 20th century Marxist revolutionaries against the Tsarist war front of imprisonment in the October Revolution, we have remained in movement. After the latter false victory crushed most of its own, the silent fight against tyranny began. The survivors were not so inclined to be annihilated under the filthy boots of the oppressive bluecaps. Change has been the only real constant in the motherland, in thought and in life. This fluctuating moral landscape has birthed the greatest scholars in Russia. Floating morality and self-defined purpose have carried through all the works of Russia. The extrapolations and interpretations of their works are not only included into the Western ethos, they are ingrained within it. Misguided or virtuous as movements may be, the struggle for change fuels us. Decadence gifts time, but time births resentment. Hope is our most valued commodity. Hope is faith. Faith is God. God guides us to unity. My father's lengthy death, so graciously gifted by liver failure, allowed for a lengthy period of intense introspection and deliberation. The rapid removal of life in the case of an accidental suicide would have left us remaining people with a sense of longing and sadness. In that case, only that subset of grief would have been fixated upon by his already melancholy inner circle. While that emotional turmoil, in its own narrow context, would have been profound and lofty, it would have subsisted on a few elementary fragments. The simple break in hormonal connection is the main driver of my sudden disappearance's sadness, he surely would have said. At the time of his death, it was clear to me how I felt. Through my years of medical study and rolled over, educated self-introspection, my sense of connection and longing for my father, bridged and strengthened by the repeated excretion and physiological saturation of my very own anti-separative hormones, had been inextricably obfuscated and then totally hollowed. While the oxytocin, progesterone, and prolactin may have flowed in high enough concentrations within my mother for her to have justified my father's abhorrent behavior, the faint love bubble bath of chemicals that meagerly pulsated through my poor vasculature proved infinitesimal when contrasted with my panic hurts, adrenaline spikes, and my sadness's stifling serotonergic stagnation. Starkly insufficient. My emotional state, neither distraught nor destitute, was my mother's largest worry at my father's funeral, where I had refused to pretend by pomp to marvel over how flawlessly he had fathered me. My miserable matriarch eventually cornered me and demanded of me a full-force apologia. I laughed at her falsity, reached into my jacket, and pulled out another of my father's lost writings. From my torn and tattered piece of paper, I read off the following little apprentice piece. The gatherings of shared personal memories is another meaty portion of the scarred aftermath of death. This tranche, of course, has been elaborated on in numerous pieces of art, the most valuable of which being the most memorable. The final parcel of a death is the reminder of one's own mortality, from one for many. My long death is short-lived. My time has come. My mother did not enjoy my truth. She scrambled off to a cluster of cloaked widows and sour sisters, leaving me to simmer. As I sat stupefied by my reality, I thought for a while about the actual paths that my father's death and my prolonged mourning had taken. His death had not been a surprise, nor an expeditious process. The old man's withdrawal from humanity had in fact taken months to complete. Those months, filled with my mother's tears and my own perplexing admiration for a man about which I knew very little, had taken my mind. In that same time, I had repetitively and furiously written and discovered many things about the human condition, but the similarities between my work and his drove me to curse his name. My father's time on earth had indeed been difficult, the depth of his elongated suffering and the rawness of his girthy dismantling indisputable. And so, after ruminating on my own reminiscing, I added to my father's little note, writing the following on the back of now our piece of paper. Your life was enormous. Your animation was a voracious memoir to pain, opus to suffering, and compendium of wraths. In life, you were insignificant yet powerful. In death, though, your work was partially admirable. The purport of that specific phenomenon continues to dumbfound me well after your passing. You have given us nothing special. No commodious or festivity-filled moment for me or our loved ones. I thought something, anything, was going to happen in our last moments, unplanned and raw. It would have been marvelous. By way of spiritual terminal turbulence, I begged the universe that I would be presented with some soothing sentiment onto which I could hold. One thing to prove that I loved you. that I love you, and you me. You have left us only with the loose shreds of a bland philosophy, and me with your curse of pontification. Your void departure has shattered the very bedrock from which I have constructed my potential meaning. Already fragile from being unceremoniously shaken by your ailed parenthood, I have obviously taken your jarringly empty death especially hard. Why have you done this to me? I reread my notes from within my pew as the preacher preached unknowing send-offs to my father's blue milieu. The words of the multi-rethought note eventually lost meaning, and my mind wandered into the real truth. I eventually arrived at a reasonable closure on exactly how we had strayed so far from one another. I simply believed that our distance was generated solely by my father's adherence to a tainted, principled value system, wrong, inflexible, and unforgiving. He and I had clashed mostly in the ideological realm, and so I knew with all of the worst in me that I was in the right. The anecdotal manifestations of our adversative value systems had always followed the same path. I had just wanted approval, safety in what I thought to be true and who I was, disguised sloppily. And he always wanted the most direct solution truth. Always following my revealing stories was my antagonizing father's ploy to compel me under his narrow moral compass. It had been a simple yet enormously adversarial dichotomy, inescapable for us always. I began sweating, my limited time and narrow path finally vivifying me. In a semi-fugue state, in my seat, over the original words of my note, I wrote the following new sentiment. As we each aged, the roles simply reversed. One thing remained constant, however. Neither of us could ever place our history at one another's feet and forgive each other's transgressions. I always thought it was your place, beckoned by fatherhood. I suppose you believed that, as your son, I needed to adapt to your will to survive. Your survival instinct had been solidified through the grueling life you had lived, of course. We always remained closely distant, separated by the ambiguous translucency of resentment. Neither of us were able to love ourselves enough to forgive. Each of us was too selfish to suspend our moral disbelief for even a minute. Our separation by force left me down and you disappointed. As those words churned within my mortified stomach's remaining tranquility, and the preacher found the last of his words, I felt that nothing had been said by either of us. I needed desperately to express by compression. As my nose stung and my eyes reddened, I felt as my poetic license was suddenly let loose by my scholarly pride's rugged grip. There was simply too much else in the moment for my ego to battle. Over the paper's rear original words, I crafted a poem in honor of our troubled time together. When the time came for me to speak in front of all our lost soul friends and family, I couldn't eulogize my father with such a real portrayal of his disappointing despondency towards me. I spoke quickly and non-impactfully at the podium. Afterwards, however, I crept my way up to his casket and whispered my real message to him. I softly spoke the following poem off my damp, scribbled-out page. A man of few words, a man of few lies. His heart set, his heart flew. I knew not of my father's love, I knew not of my father's favor. His heart set, his heart stone. Lost to us, lost on me, my heart set, my heart flew. All I wanted was more, all he could do was less. My heart set, my heart stone. I remember him as he was, memories so misguided. Our heart set, our heart stone. Our heart set, our heart stone. A small surge of intoxicating sadness simmered solemnly under my breath as I uttered each word. Silent and dead, he could finally just listen. I smiled. The radiating freedom that I felt in that moment with him, reminiscent by opposition of our disconnection, never left me. Stuck in amazement at the finality of that moment, I thought, our pain, could it have really meant something? That ghastly and grandiose question was to dwell with me for months after the funeral. I knew it in my very breath. His life, filled with slow demise, body and mind, and stained with tragically sparse condolences, troubled me all at once. His spirit's descent or ascent, inscribed with torment, finally made me cry. Still standing over him, I dropped my apathetic thoughtfulness and sobbed. The moistest part of me wanted just one glimpse of joy to leak auspiciously from his bound eyes. Like jackals behind the thick sternness of the baobab, taunting but never revealing, his eyes remained closed, trapped in some eternal game of inconsolable misfortune. It was never his choice to be plagued in such a manner. It had been a begrudging acquiescence. My father wished to be cremated. He longed to be free, not bound to the tradition of his homeland. He needed to be untied from the earth that had cursed him so constantly. Floating above it all, he yearned for his ashes to frolic with the birds. An avid owl enthusiast, he wished for the air to carry him amongst his favorite creatures. My mother, stubbornly orthodox, had him buried. That stinging truth added layers to my sadness. On his eyes, I remained intractably entranced. Still standing over his desecration, I returned to thought. Like the Eastern take on purpose, or rather a lack thereof, my father's life had only been about the transference of energy through him. Summing up life as a collection of linearized eventualities, he had remained unmoved. That was never my take on the matter. My father could never accept his own brilliance as a part of the universe. The comparative complexity of life always zoomed the focus far from him, just how he had liked it. Reality's energy, continuously transferred through all matter and antimatter, had all been novel and individual only to him. From the shifting gravel beneath his feet to the collapsing star 10 billion miles away, the marvelous wonder of it all had been a part of him, but never he a part of it. Ever since I had thought to have known better, I had mostly ignored his refusal of life. While he lay there on his swollen back, however, it all seemed different. I eventually departed from his eyelids and thought through a clear message. Upon the blackened note, I wrote out my final testimony. The messy note barely read as follows. With all of it adding and all of it subtracting, entropically and enthalpically morphing, a zero-sum game always emerges. It remains separate from him, my father. His attempts to encapsulate and understand that quandary combined at the end of his life to form an insurmountable obstacle for him, and so the unraveling of his acerbically scientific mind ensued. The gravity of the counter-undertaking was too lofty too, leaving him to rampage within the confines of his mammalian brain. His lasting words were not him. My father, all in all, derived 30 or so moments of happiness within his life, mostly unearned and thus brilliant strokes of fortune they were. I laugh at his choice of depravity with such an understanding of his inconsequentiality. The essence of the universe, unchanged and undisturbed, rests peacefully with and without his consciousness. My father chose darkness. Remaining above my father's horizontal constitution, deeply rough, I asked for one thing from the universe. I was desperate to learn from that burdened man. I looked back upwards from my note, meeting his eyeline. With tears pooling up and vision blurring, I begged for the strength to uplift my family's name. The entire church sat breathlessly as I seemed to lose my mind. With my father's unencumbered truths rolling through my fragile mind, my mournful eyes zoomed out and gazed at the rest of his pale face. Through his eyes, I had ventured into the future, past, and present, his mentality mediating my perception. In his weak and fragile face, though, I found him, alone with me. I tucked my ink-soaked paper into his pant pocket and sat down, releasing the rest of the church from their combined panic. The remainder of the funeral fell flat upon me, and I paid little mind to those around me who pretended as though they mourned for his lost life. I mourned the life he had found and mangled into devastation. After that moment, past all the pain, I took his end to call for a new life. While my spirited nihilism viewed my downtrodden and damaged dad as an excuse for negativity, a manifestation of my own personal suffering, the rest of me took his death to shine glorious hope upon my future. As I sat upon my piece of pew, my father's sad excuse for a life, braved rather than lived, came to instantaneously mean that there was a reference place and a poignant hallmark of a way not to be. His shift from energy transference to dissipation meant that I was finally able to peer upon his life studiously and analyze every part of what had turned the unbridled human spirit of a joyous young boy into a truly depressed man. With that keystone remembrance in mind, and in accordance with optimistic thinking, I created a mental field guide for the everyman in me. After my revisitation of false depression ceased, I asked my mother for a cloth napkin. She reluctantly presented my new notepad. I thanked her softly and began writing. I again wrote furiously, crafting a short summarizing message to serve as some value that I could hold true and onto. After completion of my note, and just before us strong youths carried my father off, I folded up the note and pinned it alongside his symbolized idols, the note's practically perfect memorization jammed into my mind. Clustered on his lapel, a thorned rose, my moribund message, and a golden dough-scale pin peacefully adorned his corpse. I was resolutely happy that, in addition to my extemporaneously dense scribble note, I was able to add my memoir to us. The note was wild, primarily summarizing one of the philosophical fragments from my father's dying work that had transmuted terribly into inner verbal trouble within me many nights earlier. Also, within it was just what we as I needed in the form of a multi-permutation instantiated and recollapsed, projected and portrayed compound contrition piece, precisely piercing and pipingly personal. The seemingly misplaced and stepwise abstraction-layered thing writ was alive and ecstatic. It grinned at me and through us. The note read as follows. We are all here against our will, gulping down the gigantic pills of existence, dry and awkward. All of us must remember that this is just another unsympathetic iteration of life, certainly mirrored on some other planet many light years away. While the knowledge of this steals the vitality of our actions from us, it offers us a beautiful gift. Though shrouded in our confused physiology and psychology, we are gifted with freedom, the freedom from the eternal unconscious damnation of our life force is to be received joyously, not scoffed at. This transformation from a victimized martyr to a grateful individual offers a great calling to those whose path has led them to the search for truth. This realization of greatness and one's gravitation towards its enormity dismantles hedonism's virtue cloak. Without this movement towards greatness, all Epicurean power is shackled from the gates of some false Eden, and the serpentine slithering of our internal savage leads us to hell on earth. It sinks its horrible fangs, those spurious sabers, into the nihilists across the world. Human history is thus forever dented. The overtaking of traditional values has come and gone, Like some lost art form collecting dust, virtue has been reduced to its skeleton. This ancient chassis, from which the intellectuals may affix their strings, acts as the perfect marionette to guide the swarms of people into subservient blindness. Unchecked in power and corruption, eventually the string puppet falls to the trenches of justice. This renewal occurs only after millions fall under its reign, as per usual. Even those who stave off the allure of this puppet, but do nothing to expel it, or drag nose first along with them, truly signifying their insignificance. The central dogma of philosophy is tumultuous and confusing. Be wary of its manipulative capacity. The realm of ethics has been stripped of its stability. Once bound by the consistency of religious faith and reason, but no longer squeezed here, ethicality itself is currently under new management. Here's a fun example. If one man can indulge in homosexuality and proclaim pride, then why not do the same for rape, murder, or incest? The bending of one rule to suit the ideologues of change must always crumble the pillars upon which the old world had been built, and thus the new world atop it, too. Though scholars and bureaucrats convince the people of their maintained grasp on civility and morality, whilst boasting its flexibility, we are lost. With flamboyant obscenity, the common man finds himself blind and alone. Do not be like my father. That is the truth. I almost cried hard, but held my breath for the silence of its insistence, and below my lost words something came over me to be included. Transcribing by way wrists and fingers faultful, I wrote into written close to right into the left bottom soft and intensely illegible edge of my makeshift note the followings. Equivocation of sin, I scribed hurriedly, at the last moments closest to my father. Hurriedly. I, stupefied, stupid, I hurried to write. Within that note's last couple of centimeters, barely squared the last sentence, and it read, "Stiff rules because our manifestations same abstraction ordering of self and unity, limit and love." The note, my disguised, obscure goodbye, was fastened, and my father's body was finally buried, all that suffering still ripe to become. Like I had predicted and unthoughtfully but knowingly witnessed in me hours before, that slight thud of that damn box did it to me. It was and much had been the decided moment every person pleased surely has too, where we presciently believe it to be the peak, the zenith of all things connected most and more, and that moment to be the nucleation point, the pre-punctuated point of wished decision to allow that overwhelming of our little me. As, was, is, absolute always, it came with the mountainity of nothing else but few survivable moments. An exulting cry and tremendous shudder burst from my post-deserted mouth and body and again something happened to or for or more than me. To my knees with the grace of absolute destiny, I spine and contra-right arm tinglingly dropped. It's all a dream now. The double, triple, re-stippled notes of my father's end, all the non-linearity of temporal bondage unbound by what but years experienced, many a moment in between things called past and present. With our note written and pinned on and in the ground, all except for one truth remained open and to be understood. On my knees, I continued in drenched hot thought. In memory, through me, I remembered, again, but finally full excitedly, that months earlier, my father had been able to squeeze one untrivial addition to this story of man before he was truly and finally underfoot. Though his constitution had lacked most of the bravery and forthright faith that underlies any greatness, my father had spoken one paramount truth into original existence at his end. He had repeated over and over at the sight of his last exhale one mantra. To be strong, he said. To be brave, he mumbled. It is of the best in us, not the best of us, the best in us. That sentence remained stuck in my mute voice's throat as I rethought how I had just carried him off and dropped him down, the two meanings of the moments before clashing as if they were more than differentiated by such a simple thing seeming as time. At the height of its potency, my father had cried out that one message. On that deathbed, at his personalized precipice of finally unjaded discovery, he had brooded over his youth, struck a deal with the memory of his vermouth, and smelted his pain into truth. He had felt the darkness opening beneath him as he cried out. His calling out of not the best of us, the best in us, sat balled up in my neck as I threw down my handfuls of dirt atop his casket. After my filthy by design, unwashed hands fruitfully turned more bothersome than poignant, I cleaned them in some strange corridor sink, or in some addition room. I washed and dried my hands until a note came to me, from my father back to me. Further reverse time immediately became relevant too as I grabbed the note. From atop his strange to post-mortem pedestal, as I secretly wished, my father had written me a letter. As always with life, more like a story than anything else, the message, just as my letter to him had been, was given quietly at his end. My mother had withheld it from me until the night after his death. No, at that sink, after the burial, in that room, black, no, in a room, dark. The letter remained unopened for months after his passing, until I had finally quelled my revulsion at his overdue revelations. The night that I burst open the letter's edge was the night I realized who I was. My father's son. It had taken me many nights before the dreary ripping of wrappage to muster myself together enough to endure our last communication. Most of my preliminary introspection was spent attempting to truly understand the nexus between all men, my father and I especially. Even as I flowed in and out of eurekas and remembrances, my theories of power, competence, truth, and justice remained as just words, falling flat against my impending reality. My father's written finality. I felt that way with most of my reviewed works of literature and learning, my unempirical accomplishments remaining subsumed by a special air of untruth. The flexibility of my favorite philosophical precepts was never going to align with the unrelenting variety of painful misdoings that had stained each moment of my life. That same life's during and after the notes unfolding were becoming the least of the problematic endured mania as my hands trembled from my past. There I was, sometime after his death, lying in my bed, beside a picture of him, crying. He had been so cruel to me, but my heart still beat our signature muted glow. My timorously ticking tissue tapped from within me. I made a promise to myself, saying quietly, no amount of clarity or justice could rectify the disastrous wake of his psyche. I couldn't let some posthumous proclamation eradicate the truth of my father, the father I had grown slowly to hate, who had entrenched himself into my mind as the symbol of exactly my antithetical aspiration. His soul, trapped in the immodesty of grief and catastrophe, was unimpeachable from the consistent girth of my rumination-fueled mental travesty. I wondered at that moment, what could it say? My tear-soaked pillowcase was cold and wet against my cheek, stinking of my weakness. I couldn't stop spiraling in thought, my mind morphing into some malicious manipulator, like a siren to Sailor. Through the nuances of my father's life, I searched for truth, my veil of hatred remaining largely unbroken. Nonetheless, I found the moment to be worthy of a deep examination of our time spent together. Through the mentally flashing tenebrosity of our shared life, I rifled. I found little splendor, my reminiscing conquest serving only to further my curiosity. I reached for the framed picture of my father atop my bedside table. As my hand departed from my side, a vision of a slowly decaying arm boomed in my mind. The strong and vital arm that was at my side quickly fell to shaking necrosis. The sight of my false flesh, drying and graying into death, meeting my father's finishing creth, ravished my cognition. The image came and went, but my emptiness compelled me through the unsure moment. I picked up the frame and smashed it on the ground beneath me, ousting the letter I had placed behind the picture. The gloss shattered. With this picture scraped and torn from the frame's broken glass, and my cowardice subsiding, I gripped the top flap of the letter. Against the envelope's sticky, substance-saturated top, solid and strong from past freshness, I pulled hard. After my rather inhospitable rip had finished shivering through me, I smiled upon the unclean wreckage that remained of the letter's outer casing. I had broken the seal of sorrow, on which my sadness had subsisted for so long. For that, I ingratiated myself with a sweet sting grin. As I unfolded the letter, the paper seemed to glow with significance. It was viscerally saturated with his spirit. Written with the same stern rigidity of all his life, the letter's message layout immediately startled me. I looked down at the clean and organized patterns of his writing, and my smile faded. In truth, a small part of me had fooled myself into believing that the letter was going to be some miraculous turn in my father's post-life, some revolt against the mistakes he had made against me. Only me. What a fumbling fool I had been. I had really hoped that in some maddened stroke of pain-induced, prophetic, perhaps pathetic poetry, my father had called out to me from before beyond the paper, in love and admiration. What a childish hope it was, a dastardly hope. In the moment precisely after the letter casing's tear and before my first sighting of the writing itself, I had been blissfully blind. The robust plainness of my father's writing and the neat confinement of his words allowed for my heart to regain its shard-like, fragmentary sharpness. A torturable stranger I was once again to him, my father. The letter's message further solidified my hope's ephemeral reality. The letter read as follows. My boy, though we have had little in common throughout our lives, I wish nothing but for your continued life. Though falseness and cruelty will underline most of your life, you must not lose faith in the life that persists within all of it. You have a chance to be a better man than me. I have learned many things, many unthinkable truths that lose nothing to time. One man may never escape his own heart, his own conscience. Truth, pain, and justice will never leave us. They can never leave us. The streaming vitality that allies itself with life can never be broken. It will always find us. Your father, P. Kozlov. I laughed painfully, tears welling up with each rereading. His epitaph had been longer than his message to me. I screamed internally. His child. The child proven by time to yield all this fruitful achievement, to make something of greater consequence than his achievement. This is the message to him? Repeating life, repeating life, repeating life? His name is even Americanized. Almost breaking my neck with a rapid look upwards, I yelled out, "This is it? This is all I meant to you?" I scrupulously searched for further meaning as I breathfully refilled my agonized alveoli. "Maybe there's more in the envelope," I begged. After excavating the envelope and finding nothing, I thought, maybe there's another letter I had forgotten about in the picture. After fumbling through the fractured frame and cutting my finger, I lay on the bed, ears ringing with unimaginable malice. I fell asleep quickly and quietly, crushed. I woke up the next morning in mourning of my hope, lost in the ineffable unacceptability of my circumstance. All that time, not reading his letter, I had thought the upper hand was mine. I had thought that, in some way, I wasn't granting his memory the satisfaction of redemption. I had imagined that all the things I had hoped he would have said to me all my life were in that letter, and that I was withholding his absolution. I had wanted so desperately for his entrapment. I thought that the unbroken seal was in some grand way imprisoning his conscience. With the letter read, understood, and memorized, I laughed at the false premise of my aspiration. Uncontrollably, upon my bed, I rolled around, crazed, writhing, and howling. My broken heart ailed me to no end. The wailing lasted hours, my wretched body trying anxiously to return to its slumber. Wakefulness remained constant, the only tangible constant. I held tightly onto the shrapnel of my disintegrating fondness as I rifled through what remained of my father in my memory's storehouse. I could have easily removed the last 3 positives that remained tangled between my memories and my father's purified consciousness. The triple destruction would have been such a perfect gifting to my vengeful spirit, a new batch of tainted loveliness to sour and devour. I wanted nothing more than to allow that spirit's disgusting gut, churning and mixing slovenly, to engulf his memory further. So much of me at that moment would have looked down upon that secondary death, that hellacious scene, with great ease. In my desperation, following the full self-elucidation of my own resentment's grandness, I scoured my soul, looking only for memories of goodness to satiate the emptiness that my father's lackluster letter had carved out. I found one beautiful and untouched memory. I arrived at the memory in a truly heated and disorganized frenzy, my crazed mind demanding release. There it was, the greatest good memory we shared. Behind my eyes, between my ears, and within my nose, I relived our closest moment. The remembrance was a depiction of me making my first proper pampushki donut. My eyes halted their fervent search for more, and my body froze comfortably. I was finally ready to end the torment of my elongated reflection. I rolled off the bed, stumbled back to my well-acquainted desk, and began writing. Whilst writing, an internal dialogue arose, some enigmatic voice narrating the scene. The voice was mine, but in another form, unrecognizable as my own to any objective observance. My retelling read as follows. It was the most stunning morning. School had been called off, and my parents' slow bakery glowed brilliantly with potential for fun, my little brain investigating all possible routes to help me flourish in my mischievousness. The tiny bakery's mid-morning crispness, and my glorious, pre-education inculcated away God's soothing sunlight, filled me with a certain hope and warmth that approximated heavenly love. The sun shot rays of spectacular splendor through the cheap plastic front curtains as dissipated plumes of flour danced in and out of their spotlights. The warm calmness of the silent sun was harshly disjointed once every 5 rotations of the old dough-kneading machine. On the mark of its main drive gear's bent tooth, the machine loudly and sparse repeatedly clanked against the minor attached gears. Anna Polovina, the baker, and my father's third cousin, bellowed out as the 7th or so knock boomed through the timid silence, saying in broken English, "Hey, this need oil." Once the discordant clanking became rhythmic and fell from attention, the bliss of my ear's peace returned. The soft sound of dense dough stretching, the slight aroma of sweet bread rising, the glistening delectability of lumped butter softening, it all shot me out of my body and connected me with the happiness of the world. All of it pulled me to the work table, my eyes fixated on Anna's hands as they skillfully rolled, banged, squeezed, pulled, filled, opened, closed, and otherwise dominated the dough. My eyes rolled with envious intrigue. Anna's short stature was only slightly taller than my boyish height, but that disparity was just enough to sediment her superiority. From atop her slight temporal advantage, she looked down pleasantly, as if to say, "You're welcome for your amusement." She ticked on and let me watch, not a word shared by either of us. Suddenly, the glass door banged against the old bells affixed to its hinge, their cheap pot metal exterior celebrating the new arrival. It was my father. My first thought after my eye's initial glance was that I had to have done something wrong. I remember the deepest pit within my stomach opening. My gut asked, "Surely you can't be this happy for this long, right?" I hunched over and breathed heavily, my father taking it as a respectful bow. He came over and kissed my head, a warmth rarely portrayed by him, and a reception almost never endeavored by me. My tense chest released its grip as I registered the care of the kiss. Rising from my messy head of hair, my father asked Anna how the store was going. She immediately lied, telling him how the store had been moving fast and fully selling. She was the baker and the cashier in the mornings, making little by way of AM tips. For that reason, she liked business slow and steady, letting her milk the morning's slow streaming. After her misleading yes, Anna smiled and winked at me. With my amazement building, her duplicity gripped me. It was as if she felt no fear, guilt, or even trepidation in dancing with sin. All her beguiling complexity was densely wrapped into that simple smile, exclusively offered to me. I was her little chosen one. My father thanked her and sat at the till, whistling along to the soft movements of morning all around him. After some time, the dough machine's minor gear struck its final blow against the major gear's bent-up tooth, and the machine halted. My father swiveled around on his seat and, like a hound set on a convict, walked undeviatingly over to the machine. Anna followed close behind, and then I opened my little gate. Rearwards and excited I was. They lifted the dough to the table and sectioned it into 2 large bowls, slightly differentiated by diameter. The oily bowls lay full of dough for some time. Both my father and Anna moved off to become parts of different happenings about the shop, but I locked in, wonderfully fixated on the hot, yeasty masses. Watching them rise, my mind ran about, great temptation rolling through me. I quickly became lost in desire for the exuded taste of the final product. After the perplexingly patient part of me had almost completely died off, the timer bitterly beeped. I hoped my torture was over, screaming, "Hey, it's time to fry!" Only the proofing was complete, though. Anna laughed subtly as my father stared at me with joviality in his eyes. They uncovered the bowls, removed their contents, and sectioned out the dough, my father's odd dough-minimizing technique already lost on my little logic machine. My father used his heavy hands to roll each piece of dough into large, clean globs, and Anna pressed them into circular sheets. After the laborious beginnings ended, the circles were ready to receive their delicious centers. The traditional single-berry filling of the Popumshki donut was switched out for a double filling of blueberry and cherry, my father's special twist. My 2 superiors then scooped the fillings into the big circles Anna had rolled out. Cherry for my father, and blueberry for my chief of mischief. Not only did their succinct enacted accuracy fascinate the last of me, but the red and blue dueling centers burst additionally through me with unknowable vibrancy, my glossy eyes reflecting only 1/10 of a millionth of the almost food's gorgeousness. As if engaged in a beautiful dance, my father and Anna laid the next pieces of round-cut dough over the tops of each construction. Mounds of bountiful dough discs were then squeezed together at their seams and rolled into spheres. With cavorting excellence, Anna and my father rolled up just about all the dough. After watching my fancy grow into desire as they rolled the last of the balls, Anna asked my father if I could roll one. My father smiled at me, the smile reflected in my convivial eyes. His smile then quickly changed to a chuckle as he threw me a disc. I took 10 minutes to craft that sphere, their combined observance resting heavily on me. I finally finished, and was first to the fryer. Anna guided my hand as I dropped my creation into its bubbling birther, 4 other masses following by her hand. The portly pot bubbled on as I looked between the misty oil-clouded donut and my father's neutral face, prepared to falter into either a shower of approval or castigation. I questioned if I, of all the creatures of this world, could actually be the one to finally press happiness out of my pained paternal huskman. I further wondered if such an excretion was even possible. As Anna pulled the donut from the fryer, I reached for the hot bowl, ready for the ensuing burnt fingertips. My father, angered, slapped my hand away. Obviously, thought my little mind. After the first wave of donuts had finally cooled, along with my hand, my father picked me up and gifted my grip-hungry fist with the powdered sugar duster. I covered all the beautiful bowls with saccharine snow, doubling up the covering over my own creation. After the dusting was done, my father put me down and handed me my donut. My face glowed with pride at the perfect little sphere. Right there, in that flower-hazed bakery, I was free from myself, full of something greater. Everything was me, and I everything. It was all I had wanted for so long. As I delicately grasped the ball and raised it to my lips, we all grew completely quiet, our expectant collective emotionality ready to roar. I bit the sweet sphere right in half. With my mouth swelling with sensation and my slightly wet eyes widening, I thrust my hand upwards and erected my glorious creation. My pride actually overflowed for a moment or two until my father pierced my perfected revelry and looked down at the treat. At that point of piqued pride, he looked at the half-ball and broke me open. "Son," he said softly, "you were close, but the donut filling must be separate. Take less time in closing the form. Less rolling time will help to keep things from mixing." He looked at my bemused and disappointed face. "Good first try, son," he said with recognition as his clear intent. Like some star's brilliant beginning, my light intensified. It was such a beautiful and pure piece of time. It was like all the things I had dreamed of had come true for a flash moment. My father's guiding, helping, and loving of me was so pure in that moment. I couldn't help but cry. I was finally important enough to help navigate. I wished that those couple of seconds could be between us forever, stretched into lifetimes. I rushed over and hugged him, knocking the donut from my hand and onto the floor. At the recollective bounce of the sweet ball upon the imagined bakery floor, I snapped out from my daydream, realizing that my mind's surreptitious voice had taken over my memorial retelling. My writing had almost completely stopped. I smiled sweetly into the dimly lit room, tears reiterating their constant, expellant desire. I had always told myself that my father's life had meant nothing. In that room, at that instant, though, I was his son, and that was enough for me, admitted or not. "His son!" I exulted, with my reminiscence ripe with ready anguish. I had repeated my own message of inescapably horrible lineage so often that I had come to believe it. I had simultaneously convinced and convicted myself of our combined ineffectual existence. As the recoil of my recognition of our tiny good time spent together within that bakery lovingly thrashed its way through me, my nihilistic hate faded. For a couple of eternalized seconds, I realized my pervasive improper estimation of virtue. It was narcissism incarnate, inwards, out thinking. That exact, clear, and poignant realization shattered me. It was all there for me. The truth about us always had been. It had been too awful for me to accept before or even shortly after his death, but it remained. We both meant so much, but I had preferred to pretend to mean nothing at all than to accept that our terrible lives could have been for something. In truth, I had actualized and let flourish both ideas concurrently, but at different levels of abstraction and scales of time. My heart had broken as a result and a cause. I had wanted to be free from my own vulnerability, without honesty. In that dark room, with my red eyes burning with virtue, I finally drank it all in, my lost shreds of victimhood stripped from my existence. I was here to be, not to suffer or to enjoy, but to bring light out from the darkness, something out from nothingness. Our combined actions and inactions, our dancing duel, could never be extinguished. I understood it all in one great wave. I climbed back into my bed, and love embraced me. A gentle smile grew across my face. As my tears' trails desiccated, and my smile's superbness rooted itself firmly into my heart, I fell into repose. The warm sunlight lightly stroked my face, stoking my soul's gladness and showering me with the golden aura of truth. With fission running through my body, I rested and remembered. My perspective permanently changed. My heart no longer lusted for faulty goodness, only for truth. I had done and been a lot, and it was my time to accept it all as it was, as I was, unmanipulated and true. As thoughtful clusters of memories gushed into my unbarricaded mind, I had a sudden vision of travel. It was a calling I had never experienced before, an inescapably present need to journey into the spirit realm. I couldn't believe my own unlocked bravery. For years I had been rather intrigued by my self-foretold pressing reckoning of psychedelics, feeling prescient but holding trepidations. That night, though, after relinquishing much of my hatred, I felt that I was finally ready to not only accept the truth, but to be totally submerged within it. Almost immediately after my inaudible decision, I felt as though I knew the adventure ahead of me, paved with blood and tears. I knew my time was up. It was out of my control, and that was the best part of it all. I could no longer crush my decisive drive for truth. That much I knew. "There's nothing else left for me but this," whispered my insides. I knew with everything in me that my life was about to return to me, unrelentingly true. That night marked the beginning of my conscious movement towards the feathered arms of the shaman, the inglorious zealot who prescribed to me my antidote. This concludes Chapter 1 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.